In March 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic rattled communities across the nation, a quiet neighborhood in Jupiter, Florida, faced its own unsettling mystery: the sudden disappearance of a woman. "I went to check on Gretchen because I hadn't seen her in days," recalls a concerned neighbor, her voice trembling. "When I knocked, the door was closed but not locked. I picked up this strong whiff of disinfectant, almost like someone had been scrubbing every surface. Through a crack in the blinds, the interior of the house, or what little could be seen from outside, seemed normal at first glance. But there were subtle signs of disorder. A light left on in broad daylight, a back door not quite locked, and that intangible, heavy silence. The kind that made it feel less like a family home and more like a place frozen in time. Outside, mail was piling up, a package unopened for days. For a woman who always returned calls and texts, especially to her daughter, this eerie silence was more than unusual. It was alarming. The neighbor's uneasy feeling turned to dread as she dialed the local police. A global health crisis might explain heightened anxiety, but not a vanished mother who never left her loved ones hanging. What followed was a chain of events more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Friends, family, and authorities would soon uncover a twisted series of cover-ups and lies, all set against the backdrop of a world gripped by a new and terrifying virus. But for the people of this idyllic corner of Jupiter, one thing was clear: something terrible had happened behind Gretchen Anthony's closed doors. This tragic true documentary will be about Gretchen Anthony. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Gretchen Anthony was, by all accounts, a vibrant and devoted mother who exuded warmth and generosity in nearly every aspect of her life, at least from the vantage points of those who knew her best. Born in the Midwest in the early 1970s, she was raised in a traditional, tight-knit family that valued hard work and community involvement. As she grew into adulthood, Gretchen found her way to Jupiter, Florida, where the promise of sunny skies and an opportunity to build a prosperous life beckoned. Soon, she was carving out a name for herself in a social circle that spanned local business gatherings, charity functions, and casual weekend barbecues with friends who quickly grew to admire her upbeat personality. She had a knack for making those around her feel seen and important, whether they were old high school pals who reconnected with her on social media or new acquaintances met at a local gym. What people remember most, however, is her unflagging devotion to her daughter, a bright spark in Gretchen's life who remained her utmost priority. If she wasn't at a yoga class or volunteering at a local charity event, she could usually be found cheering from the sidelines at her daughter's school activities, proud and ever supportive. Colleagues, gym acquaintances, and casual friends alike knew how proud she was of her daughter's achievements. She was the kind of parent who always had a congratulatory balloon at the ready, always cheering from the sidelines, even if it meant juggling her busy schedule. Yet as much as Gretchen's life appeared full of promise and optimism, it carried the quiet struggles that often accompany a divorce and the complexities of moving on from a broken relationship. Her divorce was difficult, says one close friend, but she was determined to keep the peace in her home, especially for her daughter. By early 2020, she had begun speaking of a fresh start, tossing around ideas of traveling once it was safe, and making small plans that hinted at a new chapter she was eager to begin. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the world was rocked by the emergence of a novel coronavirus, which seemed to transform normal, everyday routines. In March of that year, as countless headlines were filled with stories about the spread of COVID-19 around the world, those caring for Gretchen had far more pressing concerns. She wasn't answering calls or text messages, and no one seemed to know where she was. This abrupt silence, from a woman so deeply connected to her community and known for her unwavering communications with her daughter, set off immediate alarm bells among her closest friends and family. The exact date when anyone realized something was terribly amiss is not entirely clear, because in the earliest days of that fateful month, Gretchen's family members and confidants received a series of text messages they believed were from her. These messages claimed she had tested positive for COVID-19 and was being taken to a medical facility for urgent treatment. In the midst of a rapidly unfolding global health crisis, Such news felt both alarming and, at face value, believable. Still, some of her nearest and dearest found the suddenness peculiar. They knew she had not mentioned feeling particularly unwell beforehand, and the tone of the texts didn't quite match her normal speech pattern. Moreover, Gretchen tended to be meticulous in how she reached out to relatives and always offered plenty of details, typically providing regular updates on her daughter's day-to-day or the simple joys of life, like a new yoga class she intended to join. These cryptic messages, devoid of her usual warmth and reassurance, raised eyebrows but didn't immediately provoke panic. It was, after all, the beginning of a pandemic, a time when confusion, conflicting reports, and half-truths about medical care became part of the national conversation. Perhaps she really was isolated, some of her family members speculated. The complete lack of evidence, coupled with her continued silence, reinforced the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The timing only elevated concerns. Spring break was approaching for school children, and Gretchen's plans to spend quality time with her daughter, though complicated by the spread of COVID-19, were not the sort of commitment she would casually disregard. Friends recalled that whenever Gretchen had set a plan in motion, particularly when it involved her daughter, she stuck to it. More puzzling still was that her beloved SUV, a vehicle she prided herself on keeping in good shape, remained missing from her usual haunts. When a couple of her neighbors from the idyllic Abacoa community in Jupiter decided to check on her townhouse, they found it eerily quiet. Gretchen had never been one to vanish for days without telling anyone, so by the time these neighbors realized no one was home and saw that her mailbox was stuffed with letters, they contacted the police for a welfare check. The interior of the home, or what little could be observed from the outside, seemed normal at first glance, but there were hints of disarray. Lights left on in broad daylight, a back patio door not fully secured, and that intangible, heavy stillness that made it feel less like a family dwelling and more like a place frozen in time. When officers finally entered to conduct a formal search, they were confronted with a chilling contradiction. The space appeared sanitized on the surface, tables wiped clean, floors seemingly freshly mopped, but the distinct scent of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air. Friends and loved ones insisted this was peculiar. While Gretchen valued tidiness, she was not one to maintain a near-sterile environment without good reason, especially if she was unwell or pressed for time. Here and there, certain details stood out. A rug was oddly shifted in the living room. A stray wipe container was left on the kitchen counter, and one entire area seemed like it had been recently scrubbed with a level of intensity that felt out of place for a daily chore. Taken separately, each observation might not be significant, but together they painted a picture that hinted something more ominous had transpired. Despite these misgivings, there was no definitive sign of a forced break-in or ransacked rooms, so the sense that Gretchen had simply walked out or vanished quietly left investigators scratching their heads. Police officers attempted to track her digital footprints and phone signals, but the devices that might have provided swift answers remained dormant or untraceable. By mid to late March, calls to local police departments increased as acquaintances who hadn't heard from Gretchen for days dialed in to report her missing. The local rumor mill churned faster than ever, fueling both speculation and worry in a close-knit town battered by pandemic-related anxieties. Yet the real emotional turmoil was reserved for her family, who, upon re-examining the suspicious text messages supposedly sent by Gretchen, believed that someone else might be orchestrating a cover story. The more time that passed, the more apparent it became that Gretchen's claim of being hospitalized with COVID-19 may have been fabricated to buy time or quell suspicion. In a matter of days, her once routine life had transformed into a perplexing question mark, one that overshadowed the broader uncertainties of the world beyond Jupiter's city limits. Community members helped put up missing person flyers, posted pleas on social media, and discreetly tried to glean information from anyone who might have crossed paths with her in recent weeks. As the calendar crept forward and law enforcement delved deeper into the last confirmed sightings of Gretchen, unsettling whispers began circulating about the sometimes fraught relationship she shared with her estranged husband, David Anthony. Though many in their circle knew little about him beyond the barest facts, he was a fitness instructor, known for his gregarious manner and tall frame, There was an unspoken tension surrounding the couple's final months together. By that point, rumors were swirling, but clarity was scarce. To her closest confidants, Gretchen had offered glimpses into her concerns about the marriage, yet she still tried her best to safeguard her daughter from marital discord. It was the dissonance between that quiet resolve and her abrupt disappearance that truly unsettled everyone who knew her. No matter the trials she faced, Gretchen always maintained some semblance of contact with her family. For her to sever those ties so abruptly suggested that something beyond her control had taken place. Still, there were no concrete answers, only the heavy cloak of uncertainty that fell over those who cared about her. In the swirl of mounting dread and unanswered questions, the national health crisis functioned almost like a smokescreen, allowing weeks to pass without the typical thoroughness that might accompany a missing person case under normal circumstances. Hospitals were swamped, travel was restricted, and the focus of emergency services was largely consumed by an invisible, rapidly spreading threat. This made the details around Gretchen Anthony's disappearance feel even more surreal. However, her family and friends refused to let the case slip through the cracks. In the days after Gretchen Anthony's disappearance, as friends and family clung to the hope she might reappear, a darker possibility took shape in hushed conversations and worried glances. The unsettling clues left behind, lingering cleaning products, contradictory signs of both order and chaos, were ominous enough on their own, but it was Gretchen's estranged husband, David Anthony, who soon occupied the spotlight of suspicion. By most accounts, the couple's relationship had been under strain, and divorce proceedings had been in motion for some time. In a community where neighbors watched who came and went, it seemed unlikely that Gretchen would have freely let David back into her life without someone noticing. Still, people recalled David's engaging, personable side. He was a fitness trainer, often energizing clients toward self-improvement, and some saw him as charming when he wanted to be. Yet beneath that facade, rumors hinted at controlling tendencies, mood swings, and simmering resentments in the wake of the separation. The pandemic, which was already disrupting routines everywhere, may have provided cover or intensified underlying tensions. In a matter of days, David became the person detectives most wanted to speak with, both to clarify Gretchen's last known activities and to address the cryptic texts that had supposedly come from her phone. Investigators interviewed people in her circle, documenting details about her recent interactions. More than once, David's name came up in the context of odd sightings at her townhouse. Neighbors recalled hearing a heated argument, or perhaps screams, one early morning in March. At first, such noises might have been dismissed as routine domestic disputes, but in hindsight, they felt far more ominous. One neighbor found it strange that David's truck had been parked at Gretchen's place if she herself was absent. That haunting mental image only grew more disturbing once the time of the disturbance aligned with Gretchen's abrupt disappearance. As talk spread among the tightly knit suburban community, people began connecting dots that led straight to David. From a law enforcement standpoint, it was standard procedure to scrutinize someone so closely tied to the missing individual. For decades, homicide investigations have taught detectives that the person nearest to the victim often demands the closest look. That principle, combined with signs of a staged cover-up, made David the prime focus. Multiple attempts to contact him for a formal statement failed. Phone calls went to voicemail and messages were left unanswered. His typically active social media accounts, once used to highlight fitness advice and personal updates, went silent. At a time when many people were sharing concerns or personal reflections about the spreading pandemic, David's virtual absence struck investigators as significant. Checking his last known address, they found he had vacated the premises without informing various acquaintances. It was as if he had vanished, just as Gretchen had. Digging into Gretchen's financial records, phone logs, and any digital footprints, investigators began noticing glaring inconsistencies. Pings from her device placed it in spots that made little sense, given the story of hospitalization suggested by her texts. If she was supposedly quarantined, why had her phone signal shown up near her home at hours she claimed to be under medical supervision? Further scrutiny uncovered hints that David had been complaining about the divorce and venting about perceived unfairness in their finances. One acquaintance recalled a chilling conversation where David ranted that the world was on the brink of chaos, implying it might be a convenient time for someone to disappear. At the time, this talk sounded like idle frustration. Now it took on a far more sinister edge. One close friend remembered Gretchen mentioning that David had unexpectedly appeared at her home about a month before she disappeared. Gretchen had expressed unease, worried David might be surveilling her. She even considered installing additional locks or cameras, though she hesitated, not wanting to inflate the tension. Suspicions were heightened when police interviewed a friend of David's, a man who seemed wary of speaking ill of a man he once considered a friend. This friend revealed, under gentle prodding, that David had grown obsessed with the notion that Gretchen was shortchanging him in the divorce settlement. David reportedly claimed that he had sacrificed career opportunities for the sake of the family, insinuating that Gretchen owed him. Of course, divorce disputes can be fraught, but the friend recalled David's tone as particularly dark and paranoid. He said something like, "No one's going to take advantage of me again, not even her," the friend admitted, looking uncomfortable. I remember thinking, he sounds almost dangerous. Local reporters, some newly reassigned from oversaturated pandemic coverage, began to dig into public records. They discovered glimpses of David Anthony's past that underscored his unpredictability. A few articles cited prior legal disputes involving David. Nothing quite so serious as assault convictions, but enough to suggest a pattern of short tempers and confrontational behavior. In one instance, he'd been involved in a dispute with another fitness trainer over clients. Police were called, though no charges were ultimately filed. Another time, David was said to have stormed out of a local civic club meeting after an argument that led to shouting in the parking lot. These earlier incidents, while minor in isolation, fed the evolving narrative that David might have had a darker side few truly knew. At the same time, new witnesses began to trickle in with tidbits of information. One of Gretchen's co-workers from a previous job reached out to detectives, recalling a social event where David had apparently lost his temper in an embarrassing fashion. According to her account, David had accused Gretchen of flirting with a colleague when she was merely chatting about a work project. The co-worker described the memory as unsettling. He went from being friendly to furious in seconds, and Gretchen looked mortified. Police spent hours on the phone with Gretchen's mother, gathering information about Gretchen's habits and routine. Through tears, she described how Gretchen would never go more than half a day without speaking to her daughter, especially in times of stress. The abrupt silence, in her words, was the loudest cry for help she could imagine. Behind the scenes, however, there was no ambiguity. They suspected David had committed a serious crime, likely murder, and was on the run. Meanwhile, detectives sought any camera footage that might show David's movements. Though many businesses were closed or operating with reduced hours, some gas stations and convenience stores still had functioning security systems. Eventually, after scouring through countless hours of camera footage from highways and intersections, they managed to confirm that David's vehicle had traveled through Georgia. His license plate had been picked up by a camera near a rural exit, an unlikely route for casual travelers. Authorities in Georgia were alerted, and an all-points bulletin went out for David's truck. With David apparently fleeing, the case escalated from a local search to an interstate effort. Warrants were drafted, and agencies in other regions were alerted to be on the lookout for him. This development served only to deepen the sense that David knew more about Gretchen's vanishing than he was admitting. Rumors swirled about David's history of unpredictable behavior. Some people who had dined with the couple spoke of times he'd displayed flashes of anger. Even so, few had imagined he might be capable of true harm, especially toward Gretchen. She had tried, by all accounts, to keep the divorce as civil as possible for her daughter's benefit. Investigators analyzed phone records for both Gretchen and David, noting how his device repeatedly placed him in the vicinity of her townhouse during crucial dates. Moreover, data indicated he'd accessed or used her phone after her last confirmed sighting. That discovery, coupled with neighbors' recollections of possible screaming, created a worrisome timeline. Something dire seemed to have happened under the roof of Gretchen's home, and David might have tried to mask it by sending out those misleading text messages. Additional alarm bells rang when authorities noted that David had withdrawn a large sum of money before leaving Florida. One official confided that cases like these rarely end happily. As more details emerged, the possibility of Gretchen having met a tragic end loomed larger. Even without hard proof of her fate, the police grew confident enough to build a preliminary case against David. In many investigations, a missing person scenario without a body can make prosecutors cautious about pressing charges too early. Yet the circumstantial evidence, staging, digital deception, unexplained disappearance, kept pointing directly to David. Local prosecutors collaborated with law enforcement to amass the necessary proof so that, if and when David was apprehended, he could be held to account. The pandemic, paradoxically, worked both for and against the authorities. On one hand, reduced travel could limit how far David might go. On the other, the shifting priorities of police departments and the strain on resources made it harder to execute a thorough, multi-state hunt. Nonetheless, tech-savvy officers adapted. They tracked credit card transactions and phone signals, using every digital breadcrumb available. Local law enforcement maintained hope they'd find Gretchen alive, but each new piece of evidence darkened that outlook. Investigators held on to one unshakable belief: David, if he truly was behind Gretchen's vanishing, carried secrets that would have to surface. People in dire situations often make mistakes, whether it's using a credit card at the wrong place or contacting an acquaintance for help. Law enforcement hoped that eventually David would slip up, yet the concern lingered that he might do something drastic if cornered, leaving the police to weigh each move carefully. As a coordinated push to locate David intensified, local officers, federal agents, and out-of-state police forces traded real-time information. License plate readers, traffic cameras, even phone tower pings were scrutinized in search of patterns. The turning point in the case of Gretchen Anthony's disappearance came not through a single dramatic revelation, but through the steady accumulation of data, intuition, and tireless police work. Gretchen's supposed text messages, claiming she had been diagnosed with the virus and taken to a hospital, seemed plausible at first, given the times. But as days passed without confirmation from any medical facility, that narrative began to unravel. Hospital staff checked their records again and again. Nothing. Not a single entry under Gretchen's name. Surveillance footage, phone metadata, and GPS records told a very different story. One of deception, careful manipulation, and a growing sense of desperation. The text from Gretchen's phone had been sent after her likely death, investigators concluded. This fact alone shifted the investigation into darker territory. It wasn't just a matter of disappearance anymore. Someone was actively trying to conceal the truth, and that someone had access to her phone, her home, and likely knew her habits well enough to fake her digital voice. When her cell tower records showed the phone had never left Jupiter, much less entered a hospital, detectives began to prepare for the worst. One enigma was Gretchen's car, which remained parked at her townhouse with no obvious sign of forced entry or tampering. If she had willingly gone somewhere, would she have left it behind? Alternatively, if David had forced her to go with him, wouldn't the car have been moved to sustain a cover story that she'd left of her own accord? Nothing about the vehicle's presence quite matched the scenario suggested by those contrived text messages claiming she'd driven herself to the hospital. Police impounded the car and searched it meticulously, checking the trunk, the seat crevices, under the mats, and even the engine compartment. A faint trace of bleach lingered there too, almost as if the passenger side floor had been wiped down. This only fueled the speculation that an act of violence might have occurred before David chose to stage the scene and vanish. Police re-examined Gretchen's home, this time using forensic tools designed to pick up on things a casual observer might miss. Ultraviolet light was shined on the walls, floors, and bathroom tiles. Chemicals were sprayed to reveal purified DNA residue. In the bathroom, faint stains emerged. DNA tests later confirmed they belonged to Gretchen. The pattern suggested a struggle and then hastily wiped away. Investigators also found shards of broken glass, indicating possible violence, and small puddles of disinfectant under baseboards where a mop couldn't reach. This was no ordinary cleaning. This was a hasty attempt to erase a crime. At the same time, Detectives obtained transcripts of all the electronic traces of David Anthony's life. These included his emails, cloud storage, and phone records. What emerged was a portrait of a man spiraling downward. He had recently been fired from his job and had started voicing increasingly bizarre theories about society's collapse. Several acquaintances described David as paranoid, unstable, and convinced that COVID-19 was either a hoax or a precursor to global annihilation. He told one friend that now is the time to disappear and that the world isn't going to notice one more person gone. Investigators found online searches for topics like how to vanish without a trace and non-extradition countries. All these signals, odd behavior, digital cover-ups, and physical evidence converged to form a chilling picture. David Anthony had both the motive and the means to commit a crime. Unfortunately, Gretchen Anthony has not yet been found, and what happened to her is unknown. Then came the break they needed. An automated license plate reader, ALPR, in New Mexico captured David's vehicle, a black Nissan Frontier, on a rural highway. It was a major lead. Authorities in Jupiter worked with federal marshals and local law enforcement across the Southwest, sending out alerts and surveillance requests. They feared he might flee to Mexico, where jurisdictional complications could delay justice. For several tense days, his exact whereabouts were unknown. But then, in a stroke of luck, a sheriff's deputy in Doña Ana County spotted the vehicle outside a convenience store. The arrest was calm and unexpected. David, gaunt and visibly exhausted, surrendered without resistance. But his appearance was telling. Unkempt, sunburned, and carrying an expression that detectives would later describe as numb resignation. Inside his vehicle, they found a troubling assortment of supplies: burner phones, rolls of cash, gloves, duct tape, survival gear, and maps. Not a trace of remorse, not a sign that he was ever planning to return. This was a man in flight, from justice, from reality, perhaps even from himself. David's extradition to Florida took place in early April 2020, not long after authorities apprehended him in a remote stretch of New Mexico. His capture ended a tense, multi-state search that involved local deputies, federal agents, and state troopers, all working together to track his sporadic use of credit cards and cell phone pings. From the moment he was booked into the Palm Beach County Jail, prosecutors recognized they had not only a high-profile case on their hands, but one fraught with emotional complexities. The public already knew the broad outlines: a missing woman, a frantic investigation, and a suspect who'd fled in the midst of a global pandemic. What remained was a more daunting task: proving the extent of David Anthony's guilt in a court of law. Early on, the prosecution recognized the necessity of compiling every thread of evidence. Detectives had assembled a tapestry of digital forensics, witness statements, and physical clues recovered from Gretchen's townhouse. One of the pivotal steps occurred the night investigators first gained full access to her home. Outside the townhouse, forensic technicians painstakingly examined refuse bins, drainage areas, and even the trunk of Gretchen's car. They discovered a single latent fingerprint, later matched to David, on a plastic bag believed to contain cleaning rags. While this wasn't conclusive proof of his guilt, after all, he had every reason to touch items in her home in the past, it supported the growing narrative that he had recently and surreptitiously staged the scene. Digital evidence played a monumental role. The investigative team correlated data from Gretchen's phone carrier with David's known locations. Through cell tower triangulation and Wi-Fi logs, they discovered that both phones were in the same vicinity during hours when Gretchen had supposedly been at the hospital undergoing COVID-19 treatment. Prosecutors made a calculated decision to file charges of second-degree murder and kidnapping, both severe offenses under Florida law. Although the legal team faced public pressure to consider first-degree murder, they understood the limitations posed by a body that, at that time, remained missing. Absent a definitive cause of death, a premeditated murder charge might prove harder to secure at trial. The state attorney's office weighed these concerns carefully, balancing the community's outrage against the need for a case that could withstand the rigors of cross-examination and the strict standards for conviction. As the legal process advanced, David Anthony's attorney began discreet talks with prosecutors. These conversations were driven by a single stark reality. David's continued denial could result in him facing a full jury trial with the potential for a life sentence or even the death penalty, depending on how the case evolved. The prosecution possessed a mountain of circumstantial evidence, and David's fleeing the state suggested consciousness of guilt. But without Gretchen's remains, the road to a definitive guilty verdict for murder was not guaranteed. A jury might harbor doubt about whether a death had actually occurred, allowing a skilled defense lawyer to argue for manslaughter or a lesser charge. The situation changed decisively when David's attorney contacted the state attorney's office, offering a plea deal. The proposal was straightforward. In exchange for a reduced charge and a defined prison sentence, David would divulge the location of Gretchen's body and provide a formal confession. This offer was not made lightly. In Florida, as in many states, the discovery of remains is a watershed moment in such cases, allowing the medical examiner to determine the cause of death and cement the timeline of events. Her grieving family, desperate for closure and exhausted by months of anxious speculation, was consulted at every step. After intense deliberation, and with the overriding desire to lay Gretchen to rest properly, they agreed to the terms. That decision set the stage for a confession that would lay bare the tragedy. Under the terms of the plea, David appeared in open court for his allocution, a formal admission of guilt under oath in front of the presiding judge, prosecution, and onlookers. Court documents and eyewitness accounts describe David's demeanor as unnervingly calm. He admitted to confronting Gretchen in the bathroom of her townhouse over what he perceived as her betrayal and ongoing divorce proceedings. After realizing what he had done, David explained how he staged the COVID-19 text messages to create a plausible disappearance narrative, hoping that the pandemic chaos would buy him time. In late May 2020, David Anthony led detectives to a shallow grave behind a vacant office building in Palm Beach Gardens. Inside, they found remains that were later confirmed by dental records and DNA to belong to Gretchen's. Medical examiners proceeded with a thorough post-mortem analysis, which corroborated signs of lethal trauma consistent with David's confession. When it came time for sentencing, the judge made a point of highlighting the gravity of David's conduct. Though the plea deal spared him from a potential life sentence or the death penalty, it still carried severe implications. The court imposed a 38-year prison term, effectively ensuring that David Anthony would spend the majority of his life behind bars. He received credit for time served, but the structured sentence allowed little prospect for early release. That balance, harsh punishment without reaching the uppermost threshold, was in keeping with the plea arrangement that had revealed Gretchen Anthony's resting place. David Anthony showed no emotion during sentencing, no apology, no explanation.